What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about Dragon Age the Veilguard, talking about how to build a character and what that looks like mechanically. Let's get into it a little bit. As we guide our character, Rook, through the game and its various choices, chasing down Solus and the Elven Gods, both our character and the companions we meet along the way, in addition to telling their stories, are also going to grow as characters, mechanically speaking, in combat, which is a lot of what I want to focus on today. Basically, how you can build these characters, what that looks like for each class, and how you can mix it up and make each character your own. Now, as you might imagine, all of this starts in character creation. For the most part, I would encourage basically everyone to simply make the character they want to make, as that is the most important aspect of a game like this. But when it comes to utilizing a specific build, there are certainly things you want to know. Primarily, though, this comes down to your class and your faction or your backstory. Now, class-wise, we're going to be picking between warrior, rogue, or mage. Each of these have substantial differences in simply how they play, in terms of the weapons they use, what some of their combos are, how their dodge functions, what their ranged attack is. So whereas a warrior, using either a two-handed weapon or sword and board, feels a lot more impactful and weighty, a mage has a fade shift teleport that allows them to dodge out of the way quickly while also slinging spells at range with a staff or at more mid-range with an orb and a spellblade. But the most important thing I want to mention for this particular part of the video is that a lot of their core mechanics differ in the sense of how they use their abilities. For instance, a warrior has to build up rage, which will then decay after battle or without being in combat generally, which means they have to build that up for each fight before they get a hold of potential skills which can help alleviate some of that. Whereas somebody like a rogue has to build up momentum to use their skills, which actually decays a little bit as they take attacks, emphasizing that a rogue is supposed to be highly mobile, which they feel, but also that you want to do your best to avoid damage outright, so you can build up momentum and capitalize upon your abilities as you strike the enemy. But if you want to go for a slightly more high-stakes approach, you could lean into the rogue's ability to parry as an example, which will interrupt enemies and provide an opening for them to perform their attacks to build that momentum, where of course a mage runs off of mana, as do most of their abilities, so what I found helpful there was simply using abilities that have just a cooldown as opposed to running entirely off of mana and finding a good mix. That is to say, unsurprisingly, each of these classes plays very differently, both from the onset and in terms of how you can grow your character. Now, from the character creation standpoint, the other thing I want to talk about is the faction you can join or your backstory. Now, I would emphasize to you that especially for your first run, I would pick the one that means the most to you in terms of its theme and the character you would like to roleplay. But it is also important to mention that this faction does have certain mechanical benefits associated with it. In particular, each faction has increased damage against a specific type of enemy. And just for the sake of throwing it out there, if you are purely focused on getting the most out of that damage buff, the enemies you see the most in-game are usually the Venatori or the Darkspawn. And as such, a substantial bonus against either of those goes a long way. Now, each faction also comes with a more minor benefit, such as being able to activate takedowns, which is like a form of execution on a stagger bar we'll get to, just a little bit easier. So that's important to know when you're picking your faction, but again, I wouldn't let it hold you back from picking one purely based on roleplay options, because then we have the difficulty. Also kind of picked right at this point in the game, it's important to mention that this is a game with a bunch of different presets for difficulty, everything from Storyteller to Nightmare, which is the ultra difficult one, which can only be picked at the start of the game. But outside of these, there's also a custom option where you can mess around with a whole bunch of different settings in a more modular approach, which is, I think, gonna be helpful for everyone to find a place with this difficulty that they feel good about, adding even more reason to simply play the game the way you want to play it. But from there, let's talk about our major progression systems. These come down to things like leveling up and using the points you get from that on your skills. Those points can also come from a statue in-game, a little puzzle you can find to solve and get extra skill points. You'll then spend these on your core skills, your basic upgrades, and then later on your specialization abilities. There's also gear to be aware of, and then runes, and then even your companions themselves have progression associated with them that you want to be aware of. Now, as I've already mentioned a little bit, the first thing you want to do here really is just figure out what class you want to play and understand the basics of how they work. Now, I would say even going into a video like this, you're probably aware of the one that speaks to you the most, and I would simply say familiarize yourself with how that particular class plays and get a good feel for their core mechanics, such as the Mage's Arcane Bomb, where they can stack arcane marks on a target before eventually proccing an arcane bomb that they can then set off with their Spellblade. Whereas a rogue will dual wield and is highly mobile, they also get a ranged attack, and you can choose a specialization that leans into any given part of those. And even the warrior, which might seem simple on the face of it, can specialize in things like, say, leeching life from enemies, controlling the battlefield and positioning, and of course, just the pure raw power of their melee strikes via their smash-related abilities. But the other thing you really want to pay attention to as you're building these characters out and looking at the class you are playing is the tags of what each type of ability is. For instance, the warrior deals with a lot of smash and area and control abilities, whereas somebody like the mage has a lot of strike and projectile abilities. And those tags for each ability are important because that's often what the passive and greater passive abilities affect. So that's a quick way to know whether or not what you're picking up will actually affect the abilities and things you are actively wanting to use. But let's talk a little bit about those skill trees. Now, every class in particular has a set one of these skill trees. It's unique for each of them, and each of these skill trees is divided up into parts which ultimately lead to one of 3 different specializations. Now, all of these little nodes that the skill tree is made up of come down to passives, which are small minor effects, and then greater passives, which greatly affect typically one of your abilities based on the type or tag that that ability has. These are usually large upgrades to a variety of your abilities based on whatever it is they're increasing. Then we have the abilities themselves, of course. This is how you'll unlock more to use, followed by your traits. Traits are a very big deal because while you might only have a few active abilities, what you also have are the traits that you can pick up on these skill trees as well, which are effectively button combos that you can use to perform a set action of some kind. So for instance, for my Spellblade Mage character, this allows them to perform a combo to throw out a spectral blade that hits enemies, applies status effects, and even sets off my arcane bombs, which becomes a key part of the approach to combat there, even though it's not actively an ability, and that's something that can help you offset your primary resource generation. And frankly, a lot of the abilities and minor actions your characters would take as part of previous Dragon Age games have here been worked into the trait system. And overall, I would say that feels pretty good, because it allows you to do the basics and things you would probably just expect as a basic button combo, while then following up those big moments with your actual abilities, like say the Warrior's Whirlwind or Rogue's Pilfer ability that allows them to steal potions, while also dealing damage and the like. Now, all of these various abilities have those tags that I mentioned, but also things like dealing a certain type of damage. It's important to note that just because something might not necessarily have a damage type that you might want to use for your character doesn't make it unusable. In fact, that's where things like your gear and whatnot come in, and even sometimes other passives and whatnot on the skill tree itself might allow you to alter that in some way. Say changing it to all fire no matter what, which could make the Warrior's Deadly Ground ability, which on its own deals necrotic damage, deal fire damage instead, which is especially effective against Darkspawn. Now that's a lot of information and it can be difficult to parse through it all, so I'm going to give a few examples of some of the builds that I played through the game with, starting with the first one I did, which was my Spellblade Mage character. I knew right away that I wanted to be a Spellblade because that's the type of gameplay that I've enjoyed the most from the previous Dragon Age titles. So to that end, knowing what specialization I wanted to go after, you kind of get a feel for what side of the skill tree here you need to even be looking at to begin with, and then grabbing the abilities from there. Along the way, however, I quickly discovered that a lot of the Spellblade's abilities are about applying various afflictions, shocked and burned most often, which also applies your arcane bomb via your abilities at the same time as a mage. And then there's a passive that actually allows you to apply both burned and shocked at the same time when you apply one or the other, and then still other passives that allows you to set off damaging discharges when, say, the enemy reaches maximum stacks allowed of the shocked condition, dealing damage to them and everyone around them. So quickly this build went from a general idea about Spellblade to me maximizing as much as I could of those individual afflictions to cause as much widespread damage as possible, while also utilizing the mage's melee ability to set off the arcane bombs with traits like the Spellblade as an example, and large, mostly AoE focused abilities that could both perpetuate those afflictions that I wanted to spread, but also set my companions up to detonate them via the primer and detonation system we'll get into. Now for my rogue character, on the other hand, I basically wanted to be as fast and as quick as possible to apply as much of my character's melee presence as possible, but also because I wanted to take them down the role of the Duelist specialization, which focuses on an ability called Adrenaline. Basically, if the rogue hits an enemy so many times without being hit themselves, they get a bonus to their damage and momentum. And then they get other passives and the like that can allow them to gather up stagger on enemies, as well as apply afflictions like necrosis, and gain abilities that allow them to perform multiple hits all in a single ability use in order to stack that adrenaline higher via the Duelist's ability to actually get them up to a potential of, I believe it's a max 3 stacks of adrenaline, really pushing that bonus as far as it'll go. Meaning that I was playing a rogue that had a bit of high risk, high reward, where I could devastate enemies if I could quickly jump into combat without getting hit to activate my momentum on these abilities that allowed me to perform like 16 hits at once in the Duelist specialization to really push that damage home. And if I could avoid being hit, this was devastating. However, the catch there is, if you do get hit, a lot of that momentum gets interrupted and you have to sort of start building it again. So a little more high risk, high reward, as I mentioned. But realistically, you could also take the rogue down the path of a more ranged character, or even one more focused on the usage of tools and the like, such as various flasks or grenade-like abilities almost, and utilize that in an approach that might be a little more stable and less high risk. But then we have the warrior themselves. So the warrior to me is all about raw physical prowess. So when I play a warrior, I want to go big with a two-handed weapon and really drive that home. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the warrior's abilities have the smash tag associated with them. So as I was building this character, I knew I wanted to lean into that and just causing as much raw mayhem as possible, which pushed me to the two-handed specialization that sees you getting a big leap attack, but also really leaning into charged attacks. Charged attacks, of course, allowing you to charge up a light or heavy attack, which with a two-handed weapon will hit big groups of enemies, with the specialization allowing you to push this even farther, get extra attacks on those charges, and even an ability that allows you to leap into the fray. But of course, you could pick a specialization that allows you to act more defensively with a sword and shield, but probably most intriguing to me personally with the warrior was the specialization that allows you to leech life from enemies, getting up close and personal with them and potentially taking damage yourself, but also stealing it back from the enemies you are fighting. So as you can hopefully see from those various descriptions, there really are quite a few different ways to take any of these characters, but ultimately with a max level of 50, extra skill points from a exploration-based reward via some statues, and you'll have more than enough skill points to make any of this work. And in fact, you might want to mix and match a little bit of them, because while on one hand you can only have one specialization active at a time, nothing is stopping you from using those skill trees to in fact gather individual skills you might want that aren't necessarily close to your specialization, which is what I did for my warrior. I was in fact grabbing some passives and greater passives that allowed me to activate flaming weapons on my two-handed weapon, so I could gain extra damage when I perfectly defended or performed a takedown on an enemy. And this allowed me to, of course, deal a bunch of more fire damage on top of what I was already doing, which was really effective against, say, Darkspawn. And while that particular passive isn't necessarily near my specialization that I wanted there, it was a nice bit of synergy that allowed me to take the leaping ability from the specialization I did have to leap into battle, quickly, perfectly defend or take down an enemy, only to activate flaming weapons and deal fiery destruction to everything around me. So there's all sorts of stuff you can do like that with the systems at play here that I thought were really great. Which for me led to the fact that no matter what class I was playing, I was able to find something that I had a good time with. But we're hardly done because we still have to talk about things like gear, the caretaker, runes, and companions. So let's talk about gear. This can be divided up into your weapons, armor, and accessories. Weapons are class specific, meaning that based on the class you are playing, you will only ever find weapons for that class, meaning that those weapons replace the weapons you would have found for another class. So while armor and accessories are set in their locations, and the weapons are too, they will simply change based on which class you are playing when you find them. So a warrior will only find their swords, shields, and two-handed weapons, whereas a rogue will find their light weapons that they can dual wield, and a mage will find things like staves, etc. Now, both your weapons and your armor come with specific bonuses. Now, for the armor, each type of armor you find, light, medium, heavy, has its own mechanics around how much defense versus resistances it's giving you. And as you start to upgrade them to higher rarity tiers, they'll confer to you different bonuses. So both the weight of the armor itself, as well as the bonuses that individual piece of armor is giving you, are things you have to keep in mind. Especially because some of these will lean directly into the things you're trying to do for your skills. All of it, however, will increase the damage of your abilities, as you might imagine. Now, on this front, I would say weapons tend to be the more interesting case purely because they often offer you things like varying damage types that may or may not agree with whatever type of build you happen to be playing. They also sometimes focus more on staggering an enemy than dealing damage, and a whole host of other effects. But then we have the accessories. These are, of course, set for everyone, but they provide big bonuses. For instance, your belt slot and what item you have here is going to directly affect how you heal with potions in the game. So that's important because there's all sorts of things you can do with this. You can find belts that make you temporarily invulnerable upon a potion use. You can also find ones that grant you quickened or simply heal you more than they normally would. And then these can be upgraded as well to provide more effects. Whereas things like your rings and your amulets tend to focus in on secondary stats like how much stagger you're doing, or even just a flat percentage of damage. Now, all of that, weapons, armor, etc., can be found in unique variants that you can find in various places throughout the game that do specific things. Unlike the rest of your gear, unique items cannot be upgraded in terms of both rarity tier, but also their plus whatever. So they are set, meaning that sometimes they will have worse stats than an item, but do a very specific thing that you might want to incorporate. For instance, there was a belt that I found that had limited ability to increase your healing potential, but instead activated an AoE damaging effect on enemies around you when you healed. Or say a weapon that has a really low base damage, but permanently chips away at an enemy's defense every time you hit them, which, while not necessarily great against smaller fodder type enemies, could be very useful against a boss, as an example. Now, everything that we just went over, gear as well as your skills and all that, it can be refunded and reset basically at any time. With gear, meaning that outside of combat, you can just swap it out to accommodate your new skills and everything. So trying out all of this is a very easy thing to do in a way that isn't necessarily going to require a big commitment on your end. But let's talk about upgrading that gear. This is going to be done through the Caretaker back at the Lighthouse, which acts as our main hub. The Caretaker, who is available very early on, can be given mementos. Mementos are items you'll find all throughout the game that have a backstory associated with them, of course, but you'll turn these into the Caretaker, who then, upon receiving all of that, can be upgraded to various tiers up to a maximum of 10. For each tier that you've upgraded the Caretaker, he can then upgrade your gear to that level. It also increases the tier of items that you will find out in the world. So if I have the Caretaker up to a +5, then +5 equipment is what I will find when I find it out in the world. And this is how you're going to keep the armor and weapons you do find getting stronger as long as they're not uniques. Now, another aspect of this is the rarity tier. You will find multiple copies of items as you play through the game. Sometimes you'll find these just organically, in chests and the like. Other times you can go to a vendor and simply buy them. But if you find 2 copies of the same item, it upgrades the rarity tier, which unlocks extra effects on that item, making it even more useful for you. So keeping your gear up to date, both in terms of the Caretaker as well as the rarity tiers, is important in order to get the most out of your items. And then the items themselves, of course, you want to simply synergize with what you've picked out on the skill system. Another aspect to this, though, is enchantments. A ways into the game, you will eventually unlock enchantments at the Caretaker as well, who can enchant the items you are wearing with other powerful effects, such as resistance to damage of a specific type, extra ultimate generation, extra ability damage, extra weapon damage, all based on the item you have. The higher level the Caretaker is, the more you'll be able to enchant, though they are exclusive enchantments, meaning that if you have that enchantment on one item, you can't put it on others, which applies to you and your companions. So all of that together, I think, makes a pretty robust upgrade system, both in terms of your gear, especially with how a lot of that stuff synergizes to make your skill trees even more interesting than they already are. which gives you a ton of freedom in terms of how you're building a character, but also what aspects of that character you'd simply like to lean into based on the gear you say find, such as say finding a really cool ring or something that has a unique effect that you want to lean into. You can just go refund all your skill points and build for that, as the game is pretty freeform in that way. But then we have the runic system. So a short ways into the game, you'll come into possession of a dagger. This dagger can have runes slotted into it. Runes give you both passive and active effects. The passive abilities are of course always in effect. This can be things like simply increasing your damage, the amount of potions you have. There's a lot of different effects here. Now the catch to this is, though, that each rune can also be activated individually, and you can cycle through the 3 in combat, but my personal favorite was the one that gave me a big damage boost to enemy health. So after you chew through an enemy's barrier or armor, you get down to their raw health bar, and this rune allowed me to deal 50% extra damage upon activation for like 20 seconds against their actual health, which was especially effective against bosses that don't have barriers or armor and only have their raw health, so you could stun them and then utilize that rune when you go to hit their weak spot as they are staggered, dealing an amazing amount of damage. So while that effect is nice, there's really a ton. For instance, there's a rune that when you activate it will freeze all the enemies around you, while also passively increasing your cold damage, among a host of others. So on top of everything else, you also get these runes which can allow you to focus in on things as well. But then finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about for this particular video was the companions. So companions play a huge role both in terms of the game's narrative, but also simply in combat. As I'm sure you've seen on screen by now, you can of course pause the game and give these characters instructions based on the abilities they have equipped. Now this is important because there is a primer and detonation system in the game, meaning that certain abilities will apply effects like say weakened or overwhelmed, and then other abilities will be able to detonate those effects on an enemy, resulting in a short slowdown for that enemy but also a huge explosion around them dealing damage. So it's often best to pair your character with other companions in terms of mechanics that can in fact either prime enemies for you or detonate the abilities that you primed for them. That's going to get you a ton of damage. Also important to mention that companions themselves have gear and things they need to watch out for, though it's a little less than your character has to deal with. Basically just their armor, weapon, and then some keepsakes and the like. Though one thing I did want to call out here in particular is that some companions can find keepsakes that give them revival charges, which will allow them to revive you if you, say, fall in combat in a particularly tough encounter on, say, a high difficulty. But I think that's where we're going to leave this one for today. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.